I wanted to begin by acknowledging that we're on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people. This discussion series is part of an eclectic and long-winded series of talks that range from socio-political discourse to artistic and cultural discourse, and it wouldn't be possible over the last 2.5 years beyond tonight without the generous support of Vancity Credit Union that has helped us build a community engagement program as SFU has moved into the downtown core in a very complex political environment. And we're very happy for that support and to be able to build community partnerships over the past 2.5 years, and we intend to continue that work on. How to introduce Bob Williams is such a complicated thing, because I posted up on Facebook the other day that Bob has over 60 years of community economic development experience in British Columbia, because as a planning student he began quite early on engaging in the questions of the day. And when I talk to young activists and I tell them about Bob, I tell them about the 1960s when the only people who could run for city council were people who owned property. That Bob, as a city councillor, led the charge to open up that domain to public office. And when we talk about economic democracy, Bob's been pushing for many of these things. The recent book, The Art of the Impossible, about the Dave Barrett government by Jeff Meggs and Rod Mickelberg, also paints a very incredible, vivid portrayal of Bob. One of the great stories that almost begins the book is that after the election of the government of the day, Bob sits down with Dave Barrett at the only restaurant, and on the back of a napkin they start charting out who would be in cabinet. And I think it's very interesting that when you look at what we call the commons in British Columbia, Bob's fingerprints are on many, many things, going from the agricultural land reserve to the reorientation of Vancity Credit Union, and it would be too long of a list to go through. From the agricultural land reserve, Whistler Town Centre, SFU's downtown Surrey project, to owning the Railway Club. I ask you to join me in welcoming Bob Williams.
Thanks very much, Am. It's a pleasure to be here and see as many people out on a miserable night. Well, it's not that bad for Vancouver. I didn't intend to say this, but thinking about Dave Barrett and going down to the Onlay and writing out the transition plan for the first social democratic government in BC made me think again of Dave, who was an extraordinary guy, and he was a couple of years ahead of me at Britannia High School here on the east side. And so I've got to tell a story that didn't get told in the book, and which I've made note in some of my more recent notes. And it's got nothing to do with tonight in some ways, except maybe it does. And essentially it was, I was called by Joyce Thomas, Dave's assistant, the night before. She said, "Bob, would you come to a meeting with the Premier tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock in his office? There's a Baron Lord Rothschild who's coming, and Dave would like you to attend, and you'll just be there at the meeting." So sure enough, I got down there at 10, and the Baron was there with his CEO from the big power company. At that time, I think they held power assets in Labrador and South America and so on. His CEO suddenly became head of CIBC. So those were the two people, and it was Dave and myself. And they arrived with these two great volumes, and they had been looking at two of our great northern rivers in British Columbia, and they had assumed that,
it's the great oral history of British Columbia. We wanted to record it.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. So Baron Lord Rothschild was there. with his CEO, and they'd carried out hydroelectric studies on the Iskut River and the Stikine, back of the Panhandle. And glorious rivers, I'd flown over them earlier, and the Iskut has these giant waterfalls, and the Stikine has this glorious Grand Canyon of the Stikine, which is really almost one of the wonders of the world. And you say to yourself, we can't ever touch that one. But, so there was the meeting, and they piled up these reports and said, well, we've completed our studies here, and we're ready to begin the process of getting ownership. And we were the first social democratic government in the province, and so I said, well, there's a misunderstanding. We're social democrats, and we believe in public power. He said, well, we've carried out all these studies, and it gives us a property right on the two rivers. And I said, no, I've looked at all the material. The former minister agreed to have you do the studies, but there were no firm commitments in terms of hydroelectricity or power rights or the rest. And they kept pushing, and we made it clear that we didn't give our rivers away unlike the present administration. And so finally they kind of packed it up, and they're heading to the door, and Dave opens the door, and the Baron is quite a short fellow, and the CEO is... But the Baron stops, and I'm at the door with Dave, and the Baron turns to me and he says, and what's your name anyway? And Dave said, he's Bob Williams, and he's my Minister of Natural Resources for British Columbia. And Rothschild said, oh, and they walked out. Dave closed the door quietly and then started slipping down the door jamb laughing. And he said, Bob, do you realize you're the first person in the world to have told Lord Rothschild to piss up a rope? And that was Dave Barr. But, or something, words to that effect. But I did want to talk about economic democracy, and Am reminded me that, when I was a mere youth and became a councillor in this town, you had to own property in order to run for city council. And I'm really proud of the fact that I was able to talk a right-wing council at the time into changing that. And it was kind of fun because in those days they didn't have condominiums. And so a lot of the more wealthy elite in the city were moving into apartments and were no longer owning houses. And so I was able to convince all these Tories on council that it was absolutely wrong that they shouldn't be able to run for council if they moved into an apartment building. And the majority agreed, and so we were able to change that law. And the ultra-right councillor, Adams at the time, said sotto voce, my God, these dumb bastards don't know what they're doing with this fellow in here. And but in a way, I think they did. So I was going to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly since I've been looking at the new spaghetti, a rerun of the spaghetti westerns. But I'm probably going to start with the bad and the ugly and then get to the good. And so the best descriptions of the bad and the ugly about the unfairness of our system and the distribution of income and wealth has probably been Joe Stiglitz over the last several years. And Joe, of course, as you know, is a Nobel laureate that teaches at Columbia. And we had him here, Vancity actually had him here giving a lecture about 7 or 8 years ago, along with Stefano Zamagni, our great mentor from Bologna, who's the world expert in cooperative economics. And so the gap between the rich and the poor, what's the patterning? You look at those graphs now, and it's you'll see 1929, the distribution of wealth, the great peak and concentration before the Great Depression. And the other great peak is 2008, the great peak before the Great Recession that the world has been going through. So it's been fascinating to look at this pattern and then to reflect on when it was better. And when it was better was between the end of the Second World War and the early 1970s. So there was this wonderful period there, and one has to reflect on, that's an interesting pattern. What about it? And most people don't know that in Canada, we were transformed by the war effort in terms of C.D. Howe and the $1 a year men and women that transformed Canada from an agricultural society into an industrial society for the war effort. It was an extraordinary business of rebuilding a new economy. But what most people don't know is at the same time in 1939, some terrific people were brought together to plan for demobilization and for the period after the Second World War. Because they did expect at that time for us to go back into it, or their great fear was that we would go back into a depression. And so there was a marvelous team of lefties, if you will, in Ottawa that worked on that planning throughout the Second World War. And what came of that? Well, for the first time, the working class, average citizens, people that, guys and a few women that ended up in the army, were able to make choices when they came back about the whole pattern of their demobilization. And so one of the great choices was being able to go to university. And some of the great mentors I've had in my career were those working class people that went to university and were part of building an entirely new society. And it's not been noticed to the degree that it should have been, how that was transformational for us in Canada. And so what happened? All of the army camp buildings in Jericho and Little Mountain were moved out to UBC, and these thousands of new students were provided with a university education. And it meant that the professors had to just take on these thousands of people that had arrived. But it was a transformational exercise in educating people that would normally never have had the chance before. But there was other funding as well. There was a Veterans Land Act, which there was this great fear that, maybe people should at least have an acre and a half where they could grow vegetables and have a small farm. And so the small holdings in this metropolitan region basically just scattered during that period. So these 1.2 acre sites was the kind of minimum required for a family that thought to live on, in effect. And so all of North Surrey, Strawberry Hill and Kennedy Heights and all these spots became these tiny little ranchettes or places where people could actually live off the land to some extent. Much of Burnaby was that way, North Burnaby. The Coquitlam's were that way. So all of our suburbs, to a great extent, were Veterans Land Act areas. And so also then our population started becoming a more landed population. And then that was also a time of significant trade union development as well. It was also, as an aside, a time when we really developed our credit unions in this province and in many parts of the country. So it was an interesting progressive period, and it had been planned in terms of providing a whole range of new opportunities. So in some ways it was similar in America in terms of the GI Bill and people being able to go to college and so on. And so you had that lift, and the trade unions at the time actually lifting up this whole pattern. So this sort of sway back pattern of a graph took a nice jump up in that period after the Second World War. But just to note some of the numbers that Stiglitz provides us with about America, it's really quite shocking when you start. He first wrote his article on the 1% and the 99% in a magazine like the Esquire, the Vanity Fair. And he has since turned out a book. Actually, the Vanity Fair article is better because it's shorter and very pithy. And it actually, to some extent, along with Adbusters, drove the whole 1% thing, the Zuccotti thing in New York, and that whole exercise of Occupy Wall Street. So he did good work there. But I'll get on to the good as well. And the good that I want to talk about is Vancity, this credit union of ours here in Vancouver. and this region of Bologna and Emilia-Romagna in northern Italy, which is probably the most developed economic democracy that in the Western world. It's quite an extraordinary story to visit the Po River Valley and learn at this great University of Bologna. But on some of the numbers, most of us know them now. 1%, the top 1% in America have 20% of the income. And after the crisis of 2008, they got a bigger share of the income. So in recent years, it's got worse, and the rest of the folks have suffered. But when you start looking at wealth and not just income, then it gets uglier. So the bad is the maldistribution of income. The ugly is the maldistribution of wealth. And that 1% in America owns 1/3 of the wealth of America. And of course, when you get down to the 0.01%, it's more extreme. So that's the kind of pattern in America, and incomes are scary. The top 20% earn more than the bottom 80% combined. So the guy that probably sums it up best is Warren Buffett, the capitalist who I most enjoy in the United States. Warren said this: "There's been a class warfare going on for the last 20 years, and my class has won." And there's a wonderful, honest capitalist. But what about Canada? We're about the 6th worst in the Western nations in terms of the distribution of income. But it's nowhere near as maldistributed as in America. So I've looked at varying numbers that suggest that 1% receive 12 to 14% of the income. And our various family structures and individuals really do surprisingly better than they do in the United States on a relative basis. But and the richest 10% in Canada pay significantly more taxes than the richest in America. So again, we do have a fairer tax system than them. And the interesting thing I found in reading Stiglitz's newest book, which The Inequality of Wealth, was that he looks at an issue that isn't generally addressed. And that's the issue of what he and most economists would call rent-seeking. And that's the really big question. That underlies this whole maldistribution of wealth and income. And we tend not to look at rent-seeking. And I decided today that I would do a little exercise on my own. And I looked at a piece of property for Vancity for part of our real estate work about, I don't know, I think it was 8 years. Is this working? No. About 8 years ago. And it was an old machinery works on First Avenue just east of the Cambie Bridge. And it was a half-city block, and it faced onto the old city works yard that was beside the bridge. The old city works yard is now going to be a terrific park right on Falls Creek. And I talked our folks in Vancity into trying to buy it. They were asking around $2 million at the time, and that's what we offered. Michael O'Dane, who's a wonderful philanthropist that has benefited the city greatly, was in the lineup too. And Michael O'Dane put in a 2.2 million amount and got the property. So I thought today, well, I better go down and have a look at the building there that's now a 12-story tower that's called the Foundry, and the group of townhouses along from it. So I counted the units up. And there were 130-some units in the 12-story building, and there was 15 terrific big townhouses that would look over this major new city park and the waterfront. So the arithmetic, if I'm not wrong, so 2.2 million, 140 units or something like that. Land cost, $17,000 a unit. You can't buy a condo in that project under, I think, $750,000 now, and the townhouses would be much more. So that $17,000 a door And that all happened in 8 years or something like that, or less. Most of us don't realize how much slicing and dicing is going on in terms of this rent game that underlies the extremes in wealth here and most everywhere, actually. And then the other day, I was in the pub business, as some of you know, and we had the railway club and other stuff in the suburbs, and it still do, as a matter of fact. And it was kind of fun. And so in those early days, I started looking at old pubs in the downtown area because the economist in me said, well, gee, there's a terrific land value under here, and these buildings are selling on the basis of revenue or cash flow. And so there was this huge potential in the long run, and you'd have the pub and the fun of the pub, as I used to think, in the meantime. Well, so the old Grandview pub was at Cordova here and Granville. It's now a parking structure where you pay $20 a day in the parking structure, but it's going to get knocked down. So I looked at the sign on the parking structure. They're applying for rezoning. The density is very high. The city is clearly bumping up the FSR, the floor space ratio, and the densities in new stuff in the downtown area, very dramatically from what I can see. The FSR that's proposed on a site 150 by 120 is 25.5. Now, Gordon Price is here. He'd be more familiar with what the average densities in the downtown have been, but substantially less. How much? Yeah, there you go. I remember checking at the Railway Club what the densities were east of Seymour and then west of Seymour. So there's been this dramatic jump. This is going to be a 32-story building. Now, there's a rationale for that. It's right at the hub of our transportation system in this city. So it makes sense to have the densities there. But, you know, if we've gone from 5 or something like that to 25, how much of that gravy are we getting in the city in terms of funding ourselves, in terms of funding people in this community or this institution? Damn little, I'm afraid. Damn little. So, you know, Stiglitz is onto something. He's onto something when he says the real question is rent. That underlies it all. And it's easier to understand it with urban land. I mean, we in this city should certainly understand it. But it's sort of like Bill Clinton, you know, when he's talked about the budget in America. It's the arithmetic. Well, you know, the land game and rent is the arithmetic too. So you know, that's a big one. But land is this unique thing that we all depend on. And so rent shows up in different ways. It shows up in minerals, in gas, in oil, in water, and so on. All of these natural resources essentially are land elements in the economist terms, and they generate enormous rents. All of them generate enormous rent. Just water alone. In this province, with the changes at BC Hydro, these small run-of-the-river projects, I don't know what, they're a new liability for BC Hydro, something like, I don't know, Seth, it's about 70 billion or something like that? 60 billion, yeah. So it works in two directions, this rent game. It works at hollowing out things, like public assets like BC Hydro, or it looks at layering on things. So I said to myself, well, you know, where are the big rents in Canada in oil and gas? Let's have a look at Calgary, for example. How is the distribution of income? How extreme is it in Calgary? So we dug out those numbers just on the weekend, and 1% of the population in Calgary obtains 26% of the wealth or the income in Calgary. So in these areas where there are the great rents and where they tend to be, to some extent, given away, then you'll get these huge extremes. Now, Stiglitz makes the point that this is the right place to tax. When you tax these things, you're not, you know, you're really pulling back what many of us would argue is the legitimate revenue for the public. And it's not really discouraging real enterprise or real labor. So Stiglitz is onto something there, and it's interesting to to see him enunciate it. I'll get out here again. And you see it in this province in the forests. 10% of Vancouver Island is land that was owned by Macmillan Bloedel. And it now is Timber West, or it's now Island Timber. Island Timber is part of Brookfield. Brookfield is the great asset acquirer, landowner, property owner out of Wall Street in the world. And I found it intriguing that they would call themselves Brookfield. There's some kind of psychology going on here, isn't it? A brook, a field, sounds rather nice. And, our guys even in BC were kind of clever too. When we started divvying up our forests in the province on a big scale, again, after the Second World War, we ended up calling these giant giveaways tree farm licenses. Tree farm license? All sounds reasonable. You expect it to be small farmers and so on. But what happened? M&B got these holdings, and then they amalgamated with Bloedel, Stewart, and Welsh, and it became Macmillan Bloedel. And even H.R. Macmillan then realized it was all going to go, and the kind of world he had known in British Columbia throughout most of his life was going to get sliced and diced and made into paper, and it would move to New York. He was absolutely right. So the great irony is the great Macmillan stuff on the coast has ended up on Wall Street, sliced and diced exactly as he said. And so it's rent-seeking. And so, when they first gave those tree farm licenses, the fee was 1 cent an acre a year. And I was a young pup of an MLA back then, and I started giving these speeches. Imagine, you'd get 1,000 acres in the Stanley Park. For what would that be? A penny an acre times 1,000? Is that $10 or something like that? Imagine getting $10 for Stanley Park. And that embarrassed the government of the day so much, they canceled the $1, the 1 penny. They didn't charge anything from there on in. But as part of beginning to understand forests in the province, I went on a tour with an old IWA guy way back then. And we were going to North Vancouver Island to begin to understand that part of our province. And we arrived at Gold River. And Gold River had a toll booth owned by Canadian Forest Products. And you had to pay a fee to move north on Vancouver Island past Gold River. And so the toll went to Canadian Forest Products. And everything that went north on the island ended up having to pay that fee. All the supplies that went to the small towns and all the rest of it. And I was enough of a rabble-rouser at the time. I came back to the legislature and said, we're a banana republic, you've got to pay Canadian Forest Products to move north on Vancouver Island. The toll booth was removed again within a month. But I was able to say, every loaf of bread going north on Vancouver Island is taxed by Canadian Forest Products. So that got rid of the toll booth real fast. Then the double irony was, they claimed they had paid for the road, and that's why there had to be a toll. But what they didn't tell anybody, that the royalty or stumpage on the trees, our trees that they cut, actually had the cost of the road deducted from the stumpage. So they paid virtually nothing for the trees because they were busy building a road that they were going to charge us to use, and we owned the trees and we owned the road. So it was classic rent-seeking. But it hasn't stopped. It's even more recently it's kind of exciting because the two pension funds have picked up another 10% of Vancouver Island, the old E&N land grant, Timber West. And there, because it's the early fee simple land, they can just export all the logs without any trouble at all. And a few months ago I went over there to look at all that and meet people on the island in the Cowichan Valley. And And so the employment has almost disappeared in what was a significant forestry valley. Places like Yubu no longer have their sawmill, and that's been the pattern on the coast. But then you start beginning to uncover it a little more, and you find that the worst suicide rate amongst First Nation people in Canada is in the Cowichan Valley. And so this taking away of the land, kind of the enclosure of the lands and not having it available to the kids on the Indian reserves in the valley, there's a linkage. And I was able to say, when I talked with local people in the regional district and so on, it's time we join the dots here. These rent seekers, these rent collectors are taking the resources and exporting the raw logs, and employment in the valley is just not there. So that's really a kind of universal pattern in the province right now, and it's going to be a great challenge for us or any new government to try and make it a little bit better. But I must get on to some of the good. Well, I can't do it without actually talking about American banks for a minute. That's part of the ugly. That was a pattern of too big to fail in America, and we've been lucky our banks aren't as badly organized as they were in America. And there was the whole tragic predatory lending, the whole business of packaging the mortgages and selling them in Europe and abroad, the securitization of mortgages, so that all of them endorsed by the rating agencies, Moody's and so on, so that it really became one of the grandest frauds in modern times in terms of selling these securitized mortgages off. The numbers there are quite extraordinary, but one I hadn't known of, and Stiglitz again told me this in his recent book, AIG, which was the big insurance company tied to the banks in Manhattan, they got $150 billion in terms of the bailout. And Stiglitz tells us that that was more than the total welfare payments to the poor between 1990 and 2006. So this kind of grand distortion has gone on in recent years in America. Well, that's enough of that. So this gives me a chance to talk about our own credit union here in Vancouver, which I think is part of the good. When some of us walked in the door 30 years ago at Vancity, and I've been on and off the board over the last 30 years, our assets were $1.5 billion. Now they're $17 billion. And when we were starting out there and doing the reform work that has been the modern pattern of Vancity, and I was chair, I guess, after my 7th year there, I said to myself, well, we're going to have some principles in terms of what we want to happen. We had a tough time, though, because initially that was the beginning of the 80s, we had a real estate crash here. And Vancity was terribly vulnerable to that crash. And so we basically had to bite our tongue and live with 5 years of repairing our balance sheet as a result of the earlier real estate crash. But after that, we were able to do all the good work we've done throughout the years since. And so what was the guideline that we gave ourselves? Well, we've got to be there for our members, of course, and we have to be there for our staff, of course, and we have to be there for the community. And so as we've moved along, we've been determined that profits would be shared between our members and the community on a grand scale. I don't think it's equaled by any other financial institution in the country, and certainly not in the States. So basically 30% of our profits every year go back to members and to the community. So that's ranged, we've been pumping out at the gross level about $100 million a year. It means that a third of, or 30% of that is available for these other purposes. It goes up and down, but it's been pretty good for some time. We really are a pretty solid operation. So think of that. Every year, 30% of our profits get used this way. But in more recent years, we've sort of rethought that. Said, well, that isn't really good enough. So now we are determined that our current target is that half of our book, half of the 17 billion, our lending activity, has to have a significant social benefit. No banking institution in this country, I think, is carrying out that sense of direction. So we basically are moving toward major social impact as a result of our lending. And so that means that, there are some people in this neighborhood that are unhappy that we've lent to Save On Foods down the street, for example, or the Save On. And, in fact, it has been a benefit in this neighborhood, and there's been countless other lending things that we undertake. And then it frees us to help Simon Fraser here as it extends its role in this community in the downtown east side. But as we moved along, I had the luxury of actually heading up a team working on a business plan for the outfit, a subsidiary that we called Vancity Capital. And I had the wonderful opportunity of visiting development bankers across the United States. And the greatest development bank in in this last 50 years has been Shore Bank in Chicago. Does wonderful work in the south side of Chicago, essentially a black community. And they've been very creative in linking needs in the community as their work. And this is part of the Rust Belt of manufacturing America. And so a lot of the smaller businesses, and there were a lot of small businesses in Chicago, were essentially elderly owners, and they were worried because they had nobody to take over the business. Shore Bank ended up pioneering black kids from the high schools, linking up to the owners of the small industries and manufacturers together. So all of a sudden there was a natural linkage in terms of these social needs in the community. A wonderful opportunity for the black kids, a great opportunity for the owners of the businesses. And they basically transformed the south side of Chicago with mom and pop loans to renovate houses and so on. It was a wonderful experience. We were able to visit other development banks across the states, the Co-op Bank in Washington, D.C., Bank Boston, and others. And what came out of that was, if you're really interested in all this stuff, you better go to northern Italy. And that's a nice part to add on to the project. And so we ended up completing our business plan, and we hired a new CEO for the Capital Corporation. And his first day on the job was us, a handful of us from Vancity, taking him to Bologna. And it was a breathtaking experience. The University of Bologna is the oldest university in Europe. It goes back to 1088. And it's the center of cooperative economics, and it's the intellectual center for the cooperative economics in the world. And a wonderful fellow there, Stefano Zamagni, is the dean and heads it up. Just an incredible range of cooperative activity there, and this tremendous intellectual capacity. And as we plowed on through some lectures and visiting all the co-ops and so on, our new CEO puts down his pen midweek, and he says, I went to Harvard, and this guy is the soundest, most rigorous economist I've ever heard. And he's interested in all that soft stuff that you guys at Vancity are interested in, like people and caring about them and social issues and the like. And so it was transformational for our CEO at the time. And as a result of all that, we had we've now had 10 years of classes, and some of you here, Ethel has been one of the students at the University of Bologna, along with many people from NGOs and the like. And now 25 of our mid-level staff at Vancity come there to learn about this wonderful cooperative world in Emilia-Romagna. Elvi Del Bianco over here is now a staff person that handles cooperative development for Vancity and guides the tour. It's a tough job, but somebody has to do it. And it's been a marvelous experience, and it's transformed our sense of what Vancity can be. So that part of our goal now, we have 3 primary high-level goals at Vancity in terms of what we're all about. One of them is we want to pursue social justice. Another one is that we want to pursue environmental and sustainability activities. And the other is we want to build a more cooperative society. Pretty high-level goals. And now it's actually being pushed into our DNA in terms of annual budgeting and the like. So it's a profound exercise that's going on in Vancity and has been going on for a long time. But it's maybe even more intensive now than it has ever been. So it's been I'm a guy that's done a zillion different things, from the provincial legislature to running a bar to working in the forestry world and all the rest of it. But the most fascinating one, and in many ways the most painful one, has been Vancity. It's been a real uphill grind to get that transformation happening. But we now have a board and a CEO and management that buys the idea that we should have this kind of grand vision for what we can achieve as a local community credit union, where it's one person, one vote, not $1, one vote. So I could talk more about Bologna and so on, and I might do that in the question period. I just wanted to maybe end up with just some thoughts about one of our wonderful economists who's now retired here in British Columbia, and that's John Helliwell. John was maybe our greatest resource economist in the province, and for my mind, probably our best economist. And he more recently, over the last 10 or 12 years, has become one of the world experts on happiness. And some of our economists are really captured around this question of happiness, because maybe that is really, in the end, what we're all seeking in our various livelihoods and our own roles in the economy. And so I used to have a cabin up on Hornby, and John and his family dedicated the Helliwell Bluffs there, which are probably the most beautiful bluffs on the coast. And they only kept 5 acres, and 200 acres was given to the province by his dour Scottish father. And so John had just come back from Hornby, and he was giving a lecture on forest sustainability out at UBC, and an old sawmiller asked me to come and join him and listen to this lecture. So we did, and had a little talk with John down before he started the lecture, and he said, "Oh, Bob, if we're ever going to win the real battle in forestry in this province, it's going to have to come from the bottom, not from above." And I said, "Yeah, I think that's right, John." So anyway, this dour crowd pulled together, professors, foresters, some students, and government employees. Not a really exciting crowd, but there they were. And John came up and he starts holding his hands like this. He's beaming and he's tanned and he's looking healthy. And he starts to sing. And he sings, "The more we are together, 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 the more we are together, the happier we'll be." And then he continued. And this whole crowd was like, this wonderful professor had gone bonkers being out there in the bush on Hornby Island. And then when he was finished, he stopped and then he said, and they're still kind of stunned, and he said, "Will you join me?" And everybody, "The more we are together." And gradually it picked up. And then he, when it was finished, it was pretty good. And he stopped and he said, "So, do you feel better now than you did 5 minutes ago?" And everybody said, "Well, yeah." He said, "Well, I've been studying happiness, and singing helps us be happy." And he says, "So do you want to know who the happiest people are in Canada?" And I kind of guessed in a nanosecond. Where would you guess? So Newfoundland. The Newfies are the happiest people in Canada. You only have to go there, and it's just a joy. Then he says, "Do you know who the unhappiest people are in Canada?" And I thought, I guess. He said, "BC and Alberta." And there it was. And he said, "And do you want to know who the happiest workers are in British Columbia?" "Yeah." He said, "Well, there was a sawmill that went broke in Chemainus." the corporation went broke. The workers pulled together and they created a co-op, a workers' co-op that runs the mill. Our canvassing shows that the workers in Chemainus are the happiest workers in British Columbia because they've learned how to cooperate. So maybe that's the grand challenge. We have to learn how to cooperate and become happy and then have a more democratic economy. I'd be glad to answer questions. Thank you. Herb.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you. I think it's more than 10 years since the World Bank said that the GDP isn't a particularly good indicator and it's only one of many. And the happiness index and the well-being and all of this, why do you think that's not the measure?
I honestly don't think I know her. There's an economist in Edmonton that works in this area as well and has been arguing for a much more sophisticated index and has done some very good work on it. And there are others elsewhere in the world, but somehow it hasn't come together. We could put it on our list at Vancity, but I don't think I have the answer here. But clearly, the GDP is not a good enough measure. There's no doubt about that.
Thanks. I got a comment and a question. The comment would be in terms of people getting excited about the cooperative as an organizational form. I would suggest that Vancity work on the proselytizing or evangelizing or whatever you want to call it in terms of educational materials. Because I believe, and I'm a teacher in post-secondary, that a lot of people just don't really consider it as a valid form of organization when they're setting up a business or whatever you want to call that would qualify in that category. The question I would have is that, a lot of what you've talked about in terms of, or alluded to, a better world, of course, requires political will, a groundswell of support, and in many ways it's lacking. We do see perhaps some encouraging signs in terms of regulation of bankers and the financial services industry and bonuses. In the news just recently, for example, Switzerland had enacted legislation that's supposed to be the most stringent in Europe, and the EU is moving towards that. But how long do you think it's going to take for the average person, especially in the U.S., to understand what's going on? Because it seems to me ignorance is a problem in that country.
Certainly it's a lot tougher in the U.S. There's not much doubt about it. Credit unions are really very strong in this country compared to America. And in Quebec, of course, they have a European sensibility about solidarity that even us in English Canada don't when So Quebec in its own way is in many ways more European. When you see what has happened in Emilia-Romagna around, say, social co-ops are, here are these left-wingers, essentially, of northern Italy, concluded that the state wasn't a good deliverer of social services. And we're not. We're not here either. When you think of children in the care of the state, it's ugly. It costs us a fortune. These children have no love, and they get hurt all of the time. So the Italians have concluded that community social co-ops are the best answer in aspects of health care, child care, seniors' care, and so on. And so about 30 years ago, the northern Italians pioneered social co-ops. It's now endorsed by the full spectrum, including the church. So left, right, and the church endorse these social co-ops. And so you'll get social co-ops, 130,000 employees in social co-ops in Italy. 60,000 of them are marginalized people and disabled people. So they have a structure that accommodates the marginalized and the disabled in terms of these roles as well. So it's a profound difference, and it's more efficient, it costs less, satisfaction levels go through the ceiling when you move from state-controlled and delivery systems. So it's extraordinary that essentially left-wing administrations in northern Italy have determined that this is the better answer. So it's a challenge for us here in British Columbia, and John Rastakis and others in the Co-op Association just in the last week or so met with Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, arguing for more co-ops and for social co-ops in this province. And I think I think there's a positive response occurring. I heard Adrian pick up on the idea in a speech he gave a couple of months ago, and so it's very appealing. And so maybe, and it's not a left or right idea, in fact, it's simply a better idea. So I'm pretty hopeful about it. The history there in Emilia-Romagna is really exciting. You know, when the people came back from the war, they're this railway terminal and junction point in Bologna. And so the men became, hunting for work, they became the janitors that cleaned up the trains. And the women became the ones that made sandwiches and food for people on the train and people moving through their city. And it's marvelous to look at these two entities now. At this point in time, the women that made sandwiches now have the biggest catering operation in Europe, essentially, covering all of Italy. And they are the ones that handle food for hospitals, for high schools, on the freeways, and so on. And it's an extraordinary story about becoming really the grandest catering operation in Europe. And it's a grand co-op. The men who were the janitors on the train have turned into the best waste managers and logistics people in their country. So they handle all of the waste from the hospitals and complicated stuff like that. You visit that workers' co-op in their head office. It's this exciting building from these janitors. There's a kind of an atrium and glorious sculpture in the atrium. And so these working people transform the nature of their work and all the rest of it. So to see the evolution of this stuff in Emilia-Romagna is just extraordinary. And you realize, Lord, these people are a couple of generations ahead of us. So I come back from Italy and I almost despair until I get into a meeting at Vancity and say, well, you know, maybe there's a chance.
So are there some videos available or something like that can be used for training?
Oh, for training?
Yeah, or
here?
Education, yeah.
Well, that's another story, and I'm glad you asked. Because one of the things we're working on now at Vancity, and this is the big promo for today, is that when Jim Green died, the activist that was responsible for this whole place here, for saving and creating a new Woodwards, a couple of us at Vancity said, we got to do something to remember Jim. And as we kicked it around, the board agreed, and we created a committee. And so I was a member, Jan O'Brien was a member, and Eddie Broderick, the vice president, was a member. So we got together, and I pushed the idea of a Center for Social Innovation. And the committee bought it, and then the board bought it, and then the board gave us $1.5 million to get started. And Andrew Petter at SFU had earlier asked me to consider the whole business of a Center for Social Innovation at an earlier stage, and it all fit. And so there's another commitment that's more oblique out of people from SFU that will find the money somewhere else to pull into this project. So we now have $3 million. And the city has got the old cop shop up for grabs. And we think the cop shop has such awful memories for many of us. Well, some for our individual reasons and others because it hasn't served the community as well as it should have. And I'm sure we'll round up more money. A lot of my friends who are part of that project, there's about 7 of us working on a working team, and Am is one of them who's volunteered. David Cookson is here. Elvie Del Bianco is here. Thomas Bevan is here, and thanks for making up half the audience, my friends. But at any rate, we'll be putting a submission into the city of Vancouver at the end of the month. And we've been busy moving around the downtown east side in terms of the NGOs and most of the activists here to get to see if they're on board, and canvassing other people as well. So we basically want to be able to create a center, something like the one in Toronto. We want to also impregnate it with artists, and having artists breaking through the silos of the different parts of the economy. And we want to bring some of our Italian friends in as well and work on the whole business of evolving social co-ops. So we think this could be an exciting new center, and the kind of human capital that has been developed here at SFU Woodwards, or Gold Corp, whatever they call it, and ourselves down the street at Vancity, makes an interesting initial partnership to get this thing going, along with people like Embers in the old Woodwards building here that do wonderful work in terms of job creation and the like right in the downtown east side. We're getting tremendous response in terms of the downtown east side community, in terms of sympathy and support for this idea. There will be a competition, and we'll have to face that challenge, but it's an exciting one, and Jim would be as excited as anybody if he knew we were going to do it. He asked me to go there and look at this CSI in Toronto 6 years ago. A couple of women pioneered it, immensely successful operation, and we think we can do the same, and with several good Vancouver wrinkles that could make a big difference in the community. I think Andy Yan had a question.
Hi, Bob. Well, I guess my question is, well, come about May, there may or may not be a new premier in Victoria. And I'm curious, what would be...
I hope the present one stays for a couple of months at least.
Perhaps, who knows? But I'm curious, what are, say, the 2 to 3 pieces of advice you would have towards this type of idea of economic democracy on a provincial level?
Well, on the forestry side, and we in the city don't think about forestry enough. As a planner and architect, Andy, you'd be really interested in the settlement question, I'm sure. And so it's kind of funny. We've basically accepted the enclosure of our mountains by the forest companies. And so we've limited ourselves to 5% of the province. And our experts say, well, the mountains are barriers and they're just fiber. I don't think the people in the Alps or the Dolomites would say it's just fiber. So we have a real challenge in terms of resettling British Columbia. We have to change the nature of scale in the forests. We should have hamlets and villages and small towns as well as the regional towns. And that means opening up the tenure system and giving access to the land with local people. If you visit some of the woodlots in this province, the small-scale tenures of maybe 1,000 acres or something like that, and little co-op ones as well, it's really quite exciting seeing how intimate that is and how meaningful it is, and how it begins to build a kind of range of enterprises and interrelationships in the community. Unlike now, where they're totally enclosed, and it's this corporate thing, and they're just producing commodity products. So we've got a dismal, here we have the best forests in Canada, and we only produce low-value product. Only 10% of our exports are value-added forest products. 90% of them commodities like 2x4s. So it's really a kind of ghastly pattern. And I used to, when I was minister in ancient history, I hired Jaakko Poiri, the best forest consultants out of Finland and Scandinavia. And they more recently did a study for Ontario. And so they looked at all the main benchmarks in terms of who did a decent job in managing the forests or in terms of capacity and all the like. We were at the bottom of every category in Canada. In every single category, in the amount of training we give labor, in terms of the capacity of our management and executives, in terms of the value of, in terms of the value added question, in terms of the clustering, and in terms of public policy. We were at the bottom of every category. And more recently, I privately was talking to Glenn Clark, who's, of course, vice president with Jimmy Pattison. And they own 43% of Canadian forest products now. And I said, Glenn, who do you hire to advise you on forests? And I thought he would say one local company, because I'm afraid that our training here isn't as good as it is elsewhere in forestry. And we've been burdened with this terrible corporate tenure pattern. And he says, why, I only hire Scandinavians, Bob. I only hire, I don't get good advice from anybody else. So, and then I squeezed him some more and I said, well, we've been overcutting. What are you going to do in terms of, you're going to have to cut back 1 mill in the East Kootenays. What are you going to do? And he said, I've already told my people, I value human capital. You're going to have to find a value-added approach to what we do in that part of the province. Now that was breathtaking. I don't know of any other forest operation in the province that would respond in that way. So those are the challenges. We've got to get at the rent question. Left, right, and sideways do not understand the rent question. And it means this scandalous division in our society. So we have to collect the rent from the trees so you can have these villagers and all the rest playing a very different game. We have to collect the rent of the urban land so that people can afford to own a house in our society. That's a huge transformation that has to take place. So diversity has to be the goal, and pluralism and co-ops and the like. So the Co-op Association has given a long list to the opposition, and if they just bit off half of it, it would be transformational.
Just take 3 more questions.
Hi. Do you think that a land tax would be a realistic goal for future government?
Absolutely. Yeah, without a doubt. I was responsible, other ancient history, for creating the Assessment Authority of British Columbia, because this has been a major interest of mine and a friend, Mary Rawson, for some time. And so I was actually doing some work as a deputy minister, and we were advising the city of St. Petersburg in Russia as they transformed into a market society. And so I pulled together all the guys from the Assessment Authority and said, let's have a look at the land question here and what's been happening so we can access this whole database. We ended up finding out that, and we completed this study in the early 90s, and what we found was that Surrey, even in the early 90s, in the previous dozen years, land values had increased 24-fold. In 12 years, 24-fold. In the rest of the region, it was 12-fold. So Surrey doubled in that previous decade or 12 years. Extraordinary. So these small holdings of North Surrey from the Second World War were now townhouse sites and were becoming high-rise sites. And then we built all those bridges and SkyTrain and all the rest. It had a huge impact. And so the irony is the Indo-Canadian population of North Surrey, many South Asians, were suddenly immensely wealthy landowners. So my read of that 12 years was it was probably the greatest transfer of wealth in the history of British Columbia. All there in North Surrey. And who would have ever guessed, as we joked about Surrey in those days. And since then, we all know it's gone even more, both in the city and out there. So there's a desperate need to tax these huge new land values so that we can distribute it in a fair way and so people can have access to housing and all the rest. Yes.
Bob, I'm interested in your thoughts on another lucrative commodity, carbon, in all its various delicious forms that we sell and ship through this place. I think coal now is our most valuable commodity through the Port of Vancouver. How are we going to reconcile that with climate change? I'm interested in particular if you've got any thoughts on Bill McKibben's divestiture strategy. A place like this, sell your stocks of any value that related to fossil fuels. Is that appropriate?
Yeah, I don't think I've really studied that enough to really be very intelligent about it, Gordon. I greatly admire Bill Rees and others and and indeed Mark Jacquard from SFU are probably our academics that are doing the best work in this sector. So I tend to bow to them. I get disturbed, though, with some of the current answers in terms of, the buying low and selling high, and it's creating a whole new monetary regime, it seems to me, that needs a lot more thought in terms of who the beneficiaries are in that system. The previous government, or Gordon Campbell, required that all of our public institutions contribute, et cetera, et cetera. I think it has to be less of a rigged game, just from my marginal perspective. But I haven't studied enough, Gordon, to say, climate change is almost overwhelms me. And so I'm not an adequate student in the area. I don't deny it, however.
Time for one more question.
This lady here, I think.
Thank you. You talked about the vulnerability of children and how we're doing such a terrible job. So if we lived in Emilia-Romagna, how would they handle that?
Well, I don't think I've looked at it tightly and specifically enough. And I'll speak more broadly, and Elvi Del Bianco, who's continued the work over there, might make another comment. Essentially, I guess what the final clincher for me was about a year or so ago, and a 15-year-old Downs girl looked after her mother, who was a corpse, for about 8 days or more in a trailer park. Is the mother, who was a substance abuser, told the girl, never ever answer the door. I'm the only one that can answer the door. And so the girl stayed in that trailer nursing the corpse for over a week. For me, that sears the soul, just as the abandonment of the First Nations women out of our cop shop sears the soul. It just should not happen in a civilized society. So I say to myself, if there was a community social co-op there in Chilliwack that was involved in that trailer park, would it have happened? The answer is no, it would not have happened. You have to have caring people, loving people, local people that actually get together and change the nature of their community. And that doesn't happen through these hierarchies of state systems. So I'm more than convinced that the only hope in areas like that is communities working together in more human, loving relationships in a cooperative way. But Elvi may have visited some agencies that I'm not aware of.
Are they funded publicly?
Oh, yeah. No, these are all paid for by the state. They've simply said, we don't deliver very well, over to you, but we're paying the bill. So that's universal. Elvi, do you have any comment?
Yeah, well, in terms of building those kinds of social connections, it's it's the cooperative movement that's involved in that. And most of the daycare in places like Bologna, the vast majority are delivered by social cooperatives. There aren't people, it tends to minimize the isolation. There are strong social connections there.
Yeah, that's what blows you away, the social connections and networks. The great Harvard political scientist, economist, argues it's the most successful economic democracy in the world, and it's the most networked society in the world. And if you spend any time there, it's quite breathtaking, really.
Just wanted to say thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much, Mark.